Hello. So my name is Anastasia Ropa, and I'm going to talk about horse-drawn vehicles in the Radziwill manuscript of the Primary Chronicle of Rus. So first of all, I would like to introduce myself and tell you what brought me to this topic. I have a little bit of imposter syndrome when I'm talking about drawn vehicles, driving carriages, because albeit I've been riding for over 20 years and I have several horses of my own. I have also trained horses. I have probably driven a horse in a carriage maybe twice. I have trained horses for driving from the ground, but I don't drive. I'm not a driver. So the finer points of horse-drawn vehicles might escape me. However, as I said, I'm interested in horse history, especially medieval horse history, and in particular looking at literary sources. My background is in Arthurian romance, and I have written a book about practical horsemanship in medieval Arthurian romance, available from Travel Medieval. As you can see from this slide, I'm also co-editor of Chiron, the International Journal of Equine Equestrian History, senior lecturer at the Latvian Academy of Sport Education, and also I have a blog where I share some of my research which doesn't get published in the journals or in a book format in slightly more general audience way. So, Primary Chronicle of Rus. It's believed to have been composed in the 11th century by Saint Nestor. That's the legend anyway. It was revised in the 12th century as well, in the monastic milieu. The earliest manuscript, the so-called Laurentian Codex, is dated to the 14th century. But the chronicle, it also survives in two more important manuscripts, the Hypatian Codex and the richly illuminated Radziwill manuscript, both of which were produced in the 15th century. And it's the latter, the Radziwill manuscript, which is the focus of my presentation today. It's the only illuminated manuscript of the Primary Chronicle. The others are decorated, they have some ornamentation, but they don't have scenes, they don't have illuminations. So a few words about the Radziwill manuscript. It's also known as the Königsberg's manuscript, and it's preserved by the Library of the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. Luckily, a digital version of this chronicle is available as well, and I'm using the images from the digital version. So, what else can I say? It's quite unusual for manuscripts from medieval and early modern Rus to be illustrated. Unlike Europe, where we have lots of illuminated Arthurian romances, in medieval Rus, all literature, all texts were divided into the kinds of so-called useful text and the less useful text. So the useful texts were considered to be didactic literature, the scriptures, and also historiography, chronicles. So the Primary Chronicle falls under this category. The less useful literature is the literature for entertainment, enjoyment, so the stories, fables, anything which does not edify or educate the reader but entertains. It's less useful literature and doesn't get illustrated. For example, in the 15th century we have translation of Dracula's Adventure, which is a highly entertaining text. It's also historiographical in a sense, but because of its mostly entertaining nature, it's not illuminated. But as I said, the Primary Chronicle is historiography. It was written by a monk, Saint Nestor, who is credited Nestor, the scribe, the historiographer. So it is edifying, but at the same time, in before the 15th century, very few manuscripts were illuminated, and those which were, they were high-status manuscripts, Gospels, scriptures, books of hours, lectionary. So lectionary is the Gospel with readings for the year. And we don't really know for whom the Radziwill manuscript was produced. Definitely not for the Polish Radziwill family. It doesn't have connection with Poland in terms of production and origin, but it was preserved by the Radziwill family of nobility in the 19th century. That's where the name came from. What is interesting is that it contains a very high number of illuminations, so it's the precursor of illuminated histories which flower in the 16th century, especially during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. It is quite early and includes illuminations on nearly every page, sometimes even 2 illuminations per page. The level of detail varies. These are quite small illuminations. What is interesting, they were produced by more than one illuminator. So we usually talk about several scribes, or a scribe and a corrector going over the text, but here we have 2 illuminators and somebody who added details to the illuminations. Small details like details of horse tack, bridles, spurs, also embellishing weapons, swords. Usually it's done with black ink, black pen, black brush pen. So some of the images I'm going to show, they have been retouched by the later scribe, which would be worth studying in itself to see if there is a pattern or not. In another of my studies where I'm talking about episodes where horses are involved, either absent or present horses, I'm also discussing an episode where which was illuminated in the Radziwill Chronicle, and the illuminator was adding the bead to the bridle and the rings on the bridle. Otherwise, I might just warn you that the illuminations are lacking in detail, not as intricate as you sometimes get in 16th century European manuscripts. However, before I go on to discuss this episode, I need to say a few words about medieval Rus and the events which are described in the chronicle. So basically, the chronicle it's like the general history of the kingdom, but it begins with prehistoric times with Adam and Eve and goes on to describe the known world, the world in which Nestor lived. So some of it is quite fantastic. He talks about the Amazons. He talks about other tribes which live in a way which is fantastic, exotic. Peoples where women rule or where women fight and so on. And then he goes here to concentrate on the Rus states and various peoples, various tribes which populated the land. It's important to understand that Rus states didn't exist in a vacuum. Medieval Rus was a very dynamic state, conglomeration of states. Okay, they didn't have a central king. They have the one kniaz or prince, which was called the Great Prince, but he wasn't sort of rule over everybody else. He was kind of first among equals, and it was usually the eldest brother among several brothers. It was also, he was ruling in Kiev, but it was also an kind of elected office. So you got elected for life, obviously, but it was not necessarily the oldest brother who would be elected, although often it was. And he exercised the rule of authority over other the princes or knyaz. For example, if they needed to go on an expedition against, for example, the Khazar Khaganate, he would try to call his brothers and ask them to join him. And sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would stay neutral, but sometimes they might even join their enemies. It's also important to consider the relations with the Byzantine Empire, kind of uneasy love and hate relationship, because obviously Christianity came to Rus from Byzantium. Also education, literature, artists came. So in Kiev, in the Sophia Cathedral, the frescoes were executed by artists from Byzantium. So there are obviously this cultural connection, but it wasn't like the Byzantine Empire was influencing Rus as a colony or dominating it. The princes of Rus quite often went on campaigns against Byzantium, plundering the empire, obviously because before they turned into Christianity, but even afterwards there is this aspect of the Byzantine Empire being kind of less warlike, less aggressive, and the Rus states being more aggressive. What else? And of course there were trade relations to Europe, to the Hanseatic Union later on in history. For example, Novgorod here was part of the Hanseatic Union, and Novgorod in the Middle Ages didn't consider itself part of Rus. The Novgorod citizens would say, I'm going to go to Rus, meaning to Kiev or to other to the other states, but it was a democracy. So although today we tend to think of Rus as something big and kind of trying to equate it with other modern states, some people say it's Ukraine, some people say it's Russia, depending on how you view yourself and to what kind of discourse you adhere. The medieval Rus was neither Ukraine nor Russia. It wasn't a precursor of any of these states, and wasn't a single state, as I said. So all of this is important to bear in mind when we look at carriages, at horse-drawn vehicles, because this show a picture of culture. So going into categories of horse-drawn vehicles, it's interesting to note that there are several categories. We have carts for transporting goods like food or booty. We have carts, carriages and sleighs for transporting the infirm, the captive and the dead. And the symbolism here, I think, is important: loss of status, as in the legend of Saints Piotr and Fevronia, which I'm going to touch on briefly in my talk. And a separate category, I found two instances of this, are tents on wheels or vejas, which were used by the nomadic neighbors of Rus. Here the connotation is sim otherness, possibly a source of booty as well. The basic conclusion we come to is that definitely the nobility of medieval Rus wasn't traveling in carriages as a rule. The only exception is that if they're dead or infirm, so they're already losing their military status. This is similar to Europe. Chrétien de Troyes in the romance Lancelot the Knight of the Cart invents this sort of explanation that it's not proper for a knight to travel in a cart because only the convicted were transported in carts. So we have the association that it's ignoble, you're losing your status, but you're also considered to be a criminal. We don't have this extreme idea of criminality in in the Rus culture, at least not in the sources I have looked at, but definitely the loss of military status, the loss of nobility associated with weapons, with arms, and is kind of on the decline if you are seeing somebody, a nobleman, in a carriage, in a cart. So, looking at the particulars, for distribution of food, you can see here that during a famine, food is being distributed to the poor, and obviously it has to get there some way, gets transported in a cart. So this is realistic because definitely peasants would use carts for transporting hay, for transporting food, and also for merchandise you would use carts. It's interesting to see that we have somebody riding a horse, which is drawing this little cart, and the horse is white, so quite often you think about white horses as being associated either with the otherness or with nobility, with war leaders, but in the Radziwill Chronicle, white horses are just white horses, grey horses. They come in all colors, and I haven't found any particular symbolism there. It's quite possible that in the Slavic culture, the culture of Rus, white horses were not as special. Next slide, we have another instance of wounded Boris being transported in a car. So Boris is a prince or knight of one of the kingdoms in Rus, and he is the sort of character with his brother Gleb. They became early martyrs, killed by that treacherous brother who wanted to use their power, and they have been tortured and killed, and they are considered to be martyrs or passion sufferers, kind of, because they didn't go against evil, they didn't try to withstand it. So Boris is about to be killed later on after he is tortured. So here again the connotation is impotence. We see the blood flowing, and again we see a rider on a horse that drives a carriage. So very similar in design, this scene. And let's go to the next one. So Vasilok, he is another victim of the family strifes in medieval Rus, which happened quite often. So in the Primary Chronicle you get lots and lots of family vendettas, brothers attacking each other, distant relatives, they're all related. Sometimes they're even brothers, but striving for power. So obviously those who were less warlike, less violent, less brutal would suffer, and quite often we would see terrible punishments or terrible tortures inflicted on them. Well, not quite often, but this happens. So Boris and Gleb is one example, and Vasilok is another example. He is blinded. So blinding the enemy, it has practical connotation because a blind ruler cannot be an effective warrior. It also has symbolic connotations. It's in symbolism, it's similar to impotence. You cannot exercise your military powers, but it's also similar to the loss of a man's potence. And as he loses his status, he is transported in a cart as a sick man. Obviously he could have ridden. It's not a disability which prevents you from riding, but he's also a prisoner, And again, he's imprisoned unjustly, unlawfully, not for something, a crime which he has committed, but because he's a victim of his relatives, his cruel brother. And we have quite an escort with him, helping to transport him. Okay, now we have something different. We have from wound to blindness to death. Dead Yarapolk is transported in a sleigh, so in winter time. Obviously, you couldn't use cars or carriages on those roads, but during winter months there was plenty of snow. You could easily use a sleigh. And again, we have the leading horse ridden. And here we have suggestion of the way Yarapolk was killed. So in difference from Boris and in difference from Vasilok, Yarapolk is the treacherous, the bad guy. Okay, he's one who has been making war unjustly, and it's quite just that he suffered death. Also, we don't see him either because they didn't want to show a dead person, or because he's not worth seeing. We see the characters who are suffering, but they're kind of good characters, the good guys, and we can take pity on them. I see in their faces, it's almost like admiring their martyrdom, and here is the bad guy, so it's better not to remember him, or remember him only in a bad way and not see him, so you don't feel any personal attachment, any pity on him. Looking at the vehicle, you see the sleigh is quite big. It got these shafts attaching to the horse, because the horse has got a collar. And I think this is one of the pictures where the second illuminator was just adding examples in like black pen with the bridle on the horse. Going on, we see another instance of a dead person being transported, this time in a cart. We have a coffin on the wheels of the Andrei Bogolyubov. He's already prepared for burial. In this case, the coffin is closed. And familiarly, we see a rider on the driving horse. The rider also wears sharp spurs. Here, definitely, it was the later illuminator at work, because he likes big sharp spurs, and it's typical spur for the 16th century. But if you are familiar with the illuminations of horse tech from medieval Europe, where they have curved bits with prominent shanks, you see here that there is no indication that this is a curved bit. Could just as well have been a snaffle bit. We don't really see any detail. So, going on, comparative motive. I was promising to talk about Saint Peter Fevronia, who lived in the 12th century in Murom. So the Saint Peter Fevronia of Murom. Their life, so the legend was added in the 15th, 16th century, but they were venerated long before this. And I don't have time here to talk about their story in much detail, but you can visit my blog at the Grail Quest on patreon.com, and there is a free video paper of my discussion of the story of Peter and Fevronia, where I'm discussing it. It's an incredible story. Unfortunately, I don't think it was ever translated into English, but it's like romance and saint's life all rolled into one, with dragons, with treachery, with the deviously cunning lady Fevronia, who makes it to be a saint. It's an incredible story, and she made it she contrived not only to become the wife of a noble prince, but she also contrived to be a saint, and she was a beekeeper's daughter, lowborn. Basically, in the story, Piotr suffers from an illness. You might think from the description it's leprosy, but he gets this illness from fighting a serpent or a dragon who's been importuning his brother's wife. And the dragon's poison causes him to go leprous, and he cannot be killed by anyone until somebody hears that there is this healer in one of the villages in Ryazan. So Petr's messenger goes there, meets Fevronia, and she says that yes, she can heal the prince, but he needs to come there, and he comes in a cart because obviously he cannot ride. She heals him in exchange for a promise that he would marry her, and he fails on this promise. So the leprosy returns, and he has to be transported in a cart again and go back to Fevronia, who kills him again. And after this he marries her. The story doesn't end there because it goes on, they get more adventure, it gets even more incredible, and there is obviously a happy ending. But it's important to see that in the illuminations, this scene, and also in icons, there are these historiographic icons which tell you this whole story in little images around the central image. Almost like a bande dessinée, cartoon strip. We see again and again the same motif of Piotr being transported in a cart, sometimes even twice, like in this manuscript I'm showing here. This scene is repeated twice, so obviously it's important, and the cart is symbolizing this shift from military prowess, bodily prowess, somebody who is a dragon killer. Where else? How much higher can you go than this, and how much lower can you fall from there to be transported infirm in a cart? There is a suggestion that it's a fall not only physical but also moral, the fall into pride, from which he needs to be healed by kind of agreeing to Fevronia's conditions and marrying her, getting low. Okay. So time to wrap up, and let's go to our final group of examples, the vejas or tens. So the vejas were used by the Cumans or Polovtsi, nomadic military people who lived on the borders of the Rus states. And there are two images in the Radziwill manuscript of the Primary Chronicle, which shows the capture of this vejas. So there is a suggestion that there is some precious booty in there. And in other literary sources we also have references to these tens, vejas, and to taking rich booty after capturing the tens. So here is one. It basically does look like a triangular tent on wheels. And here is a similar one again. The Cuman is riding a horse, and there is some fighting going on, or some division of the booty, and there are some prisoners in the tents. So they are not quite clear here. If we go back to the previous slide, we might see this more clearly, but it's not clear if there are two wheels or one wheel. Probably two wheels, it's easier. An interesting note on the horse, it's a gated horse. So I'm almost at the end. There is one more image. Here we can clearly see it's one wheel vehicle with the strangely 7 spokes on the wheel, and Vsevolod Yurievich is making war against the Cumans, so he's pursuing the Cumans who are fleeing very fast. And this is an unusual one, but I wanted to add on this. Obviously not a horse-drawn but human-drawn vehicle. It's the violence of the obers over the dulebs. So this is an episode from the early part of the Primary Chronicle, where the obers, this early tribe living on the territory of which later was made into Rus, they made war against the obers and kind of totally defeated them. And just to add insult to injury, they put the dulep women, harnessed them into carts and made them draw the carts. How much more insulting and harsh you can get on your enemies. And yeah. And he's got a whip as well. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope this was interesting for you. And if you have questions, I'm very open to answering them. So thank you.